essentially, Congress passed a law. President Clinton signed it. I think Clinton signed it not so much because he wanted to sign that per se, because he wanted to pass the broader Telecommunications Act, and this happened to be stuck into it, which basically said that kind of speech would not be allowed on the internet. That was obviously a huge problem, and suddenly I found myself kind of playing an activist role, trying to basically raise the alarm about this. And my thinking at the time was that I would primarily focus on essentially trying to educate journalists, because one of the most disappointing things that I found, by the way, hopefully we'll get to this at some point, but this hasn't changed at all, is that it turns out journalists have some of the most hazy and ill-formed understandings of free speech of any cohort I've encountered.
Net activist, journalist, and content designer Todd Lappin joins John and Scoop this time on the Plutopia podcast. We discuss free speech, the Communications Decency Act, control of misinformation versus free speech, his work at Wired Magazine, Facebook and the Metaverse, his tiny fire truck, and much more.
Hey everybody, welcome to the latest episode of the Plutopia podcast. Our guest today is Todd Lappin. Todd is a technologist, a designer, and he says lapsed journalist. We'll find out how lapsed he is. He's based out in the Bay Area, and he's been working for like 3 decades online. I mean, he's spent all that time really fascinated by the internet and its potential and the impact it's having. And you know, he was there when it was really, really good and promising, and he's still there now that we're starting to wonder. So, hey, Todd, how are you?
Hey, good to see you, John. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad you're here. I guess the first question is, maybe we should talk a little bit about the early history of net activism, because we were both sort of into that. Who is the Internet Cartel?
The Internet Cartel?
You're supposed to say there is no Internet Cartel.
There is no, I've never heard of it. So
oh, you don't remember that? That's something that Shabir and Jonah used to do when we would gather at the Computer Freedoms and Privacy Conference, and they would say, who is the Internet Cartel? There is no Internet Cartel.
I guess everybody wonders about that now, though. I guess once upon a time that was an absurd question. I guess now it's maybe a little bit more imminent.
Well, how did you become a net activist?
A little bit by accident and a little bit by disposition. Let's see. Just to back up for just a quick second, you know, my background academically is in Chinese culture. I have a background in ancient Chinese intellectual history. And some of my first work out of college was working as, I ended up very serendipitously, as so many things often are, especially at that age, involved with a China writer named Orville Schell. So I ended up doing a lot of my early journalism experience was actually working on contemporary Chinese culture and politics. So I was pretty involved in kind of telling about what was happening in China in the post-Tiananmen period, sort of, you know, in 1991, 92, 93, which really involved a lot of thinking deeply about speech, civil liberties, all that kind of stuff that basically China didn't have. And then around 1994, 95, I guess, I became an editor at Wired Magazine. Wired asked me, again, somewhat serendipitously, to cover what they were calling, you know, the cyber rights beat, which was pretty much everything having to do with internet regulation and policy. And it was shortly after that the Communications Decency Act was passed, which, for those, it's sort of a little bit of a tragedy that people don't remember this moment a little bit more in context, because I think, you know, a lot of the conversations we have now derive directly from that moment. But essentially in 1995, as part of the Telecommunications Act, Congress passed some regulation which effectively tried to regulate internet speech the same way, under the same set of guidelines that are used to regulate broadcast radio and television speech, which is to say the indecency standard. The indecency standard is a pretty low bar. The F-bomb is not tolerable under the indecency standard. So it's not even like we're talking about nudity and all that, which of course would have been out of the question, but we're really talking about really basic, what we would just call salty speech. And I'm sorry.
I was saying, who defines what's decent and what's not?
Yeah, well, at the time, that was the answer to that was the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And if you've ever heard George Carlin's monologue, it's an old monologue that George Carlin used to do, where he would talk about the 7 dirty words you can't say on TV. And I don't know what kind of a podcast you're running here, so I won't run through them, but
it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, I think it was something like shit, piss, fuck, cocksucker, motherfucker. There was something like that. There was a bunch of words which are just kind of salty, and which were regulated by the FCC. So essentially, Congress passed a law. President Clinton signed it. I think Clinton signed it not so much because he wanted to sign that per se, because he wanted to pass the broader Telecommunications Act, and this happened to be stuck into it. Which basically said that kind of speech would not be allowed on the internet. That was obviously a huge problem. And suddenly I found myself kind of playing an activist role, trying to basically raise the alarm about this. And my thinking at the time was that I would primarily focus on essentially trying to educate journalists, because one of the most disappointing things that I found, by the way, hopefully we'll get to this at some point, but this hasn't changed at all, is that it turns out journalists have some of the most hazy and ill-formed understandings of free speech of any cohort I've encountered. Unfortunately, they write about it a lot, often from a position of deep ignorance and mistaken assumptions. And so so much of, at the time, so much of the atmosphere was being fomented by journalists kind of doing that thing they do, where they're sort of creating a sense of moral panic. The internet is full of porn. The internet is full of bad things. And, without really realizing the trade-offs that were potentially involved in really clamping down on that stuff. So that's kind of how I got involved, was trying to really raise awareness of the speech issues that this legislation passed, and raise awareness about essentially how important it would be to have a robust framework for speech, for free expression on the internet. And it's important to remember, this was 1995 or 96. It was early. And I think that's something, again, I'd love to talk about at some point, but a big part of the thinking of that time was that, look, we're at the beginning of something. This is not, we need to sort of allow this nascent technology and this nascent platform to manifest itself. And so we don't really know what it should be or what it wants to be. Let's just not essentially smother it before it even has an opportunity to express itself in the world.
I noticed that in my time associating with journalists, especially out in the Bay Area, that no one was really concerned about censorship or content until it was it was their content that was censored. And then all of a sudden it became a big deal. But most people seem to assume, well, it can't happen to me.
Well, it can't happen to me, or kind of, what about the children? You know what I'm saying? I think that's kind of what tends to happen, is journalists tend to think because they are formally journalists that they occupy some sort of privileged position, and that it can't happen to them. And again, they often operate under a sense of, again, even as a journalist, I don't understand this, a sense of obligation to highlight harms without really understanding about the complexities of some of these things. And so seeing journalists effectively advocating for censorship was really, really disturbing to me at the time, and still is.
Well, I was going to get to this later, but let's get to it now. Part of the problem we have right now is that it's the internet mainstreamed and evolved, and now pretty much everybody has some kind of internet access, and they're all exposed, and they also all have access to expose others. And what we see is a subversion of the idea of journalism and news. We see things being presented online as though they were news, as though they were true and correct, and they're not really. and we see dangerous things online. We see COVID misinformation. We see political manipulation. So there is definitely a reason to have some, I guess, information anxiety right now. But the question is, how do you address all that stuff without, to whatever extent, disabling the principle of free speech? And I expect you to have the answer to that.
This is a really complicated question, super duper complicated. And as I've thought about it a lot in the last couple of years, and I have spent a bunch of time thinking about that in the last couple of years, I'm sort of increasingly, I tend to take a historical lens to that question. And essentially, another way to put it is a historical / McLuhanite, Marshall McLuhanite lens on that question, which is to say, I'm not sure that there's a policy solution. I think there's a human solution, meaning I think as a species, we will get to the point where the radical empowerment and the radical democratization of information that comes from the internet will just become mundane to us. And we will reach the point probably at some point, hopefully on the sooner side, but where these things are just kind of normal. And the only reason I say that is because we've had to do this many times before, and it wasn't regulation that solved these problems. And I'm not anti-regulation, to be clear. I just have very low expectations of what regulation can actually do. So, we've had to do this before. And again, this is something I've thought about a lot in the last couple of years. Often it's been extremely messy, but look, I mean, it's very difficult. We forget, like, the printing press was radical. You know what I mean? And I know it's a cliche to say, oh, the printing press, but that doesn't make it any less radical. And it doesn't make it any less profound, the impact that it had on culture and on society. It was deeply traumatic. There's a direct connection between the printing press and Martin Luther and the Protestant Revolution and a long series of civil wars in Europe, and eventually the Enlightenment and the United States itself. All of this is pretty directly attributable to the democratizing effect of the printing press. What you see there, and again, I don't mean to, I understand how kind of unsatisfying that is as a way of looking at things in a way, but this was happening all over the world in a bunch of different countries. There was no singular regulatory regime that helped us normalize our relationship with the printed book. But eventually we did. We kind of came to a place where we started to understand that, like, books are books and they're going to have an impact in the world. But overall, on balance, you both take books with a grain of salt and you encourage free publishing because it's better than the alternatives. We had to do this with photography. It's hard to overstate how radical photography was. You go from an oral and illustrated tradition for basically all of human history to suddenly these images that represent themselves as being what really happened. Photo manipulation was a concern from the very, very beginning. The impact of a photo was a concern from the very, very beginning. Privacy issues of who owns your image in somebody else's photo, these were hard problems for a long time. But we were able to normalize our relationship with them through a combination of a bunch of essentially judicial understandings, and again, kind of just familiarity with the medium and with what it does. Radio, it's hard to overstate how radical radio was, and I think in some ways we still are dealing with how radical radio was, especially in the 20s. The connection between the rise of Hitler and radio is very, very direct. We think of Orson Welles and War of the Worlds, which was just a misinformation story that was confusing at the time. But then, and I actually wrote about this when I was at Wired. I wrote an article about the impact of radio in 1995, which I think has aged pretty well in a funny way. I went back and read it recently. It took a long time for us to do that, to the point where essentially having a clock radio next to your kid's bed is not considered a dangerous thing. So my general perspective on this is that, we're going to try some things. Those things will probably not have the impact that we want. They may even at times be counterproductive, but there will come a time, hopefully before too much trauma, where we are just used to a world where there's radically democratized and radically empowered speakers speaking to us from all over these different platforms, and there we go.
You talk about radical radio. That's where I got into journalism at the early days of that movement. It was I started out actually in AM radio, which is very conservative and very bound by rules. It was in the same little town in West Texas where John and I both grew up. And I got into the big markets, and they started having FM radio, and it started sounding a lot different from what people had been hearing on radio. And over the years, there have been regulations that have come about that basically killed radio. Because if you look at listen to the radio now, there are very few independent radio stations. That's mostly owned by very huge conglomerates. There's very little local radio. You could, and that was the whole purpose of radio, is to serve the public. It was a public service when it started, and now it's just a pipeline to New York or Los Angeles, where all the programming originates. So
now you've got podcasts.
Yeah. And I just found that regulations were a double-edged sword. Sometimes it's for the good of the people, and often it's not.
I think that's right. I mean, again, and I'm not anti-regulation. I just have very low expectations of it. And I also think that unintended consequences are something that, again, as somebody who's at least old enough now that I can start to track some of that, like, oh, I thought it was going to do this and it actually did that. So, I always take the notion of unintended consequences as part of a regulatory framework at any given moment. But I think what you're saying is exactly right. Radio is weird relative to the internet, or unusual. I mean, this is the thing. And again, you understand this well. Radio, there was a natural and actually legal and logical reason why the government could regulate radio, because broadcast spectrum was a finite public resource. Allocating it was a government function. And in order to broadcast, you had to have a license to use a slice of that spectrum. And that was the nexus through which content regulation on radio and broadcast television could happen. And that framework, again, not perfect at all, but essentially that framework shaped our expectations of media for about 50 years, up until around the 70s, from around the 20s to the 70s. And we think of that as a somewhat tranquil age. Of course, anybody who was around during that time also remembers everybody complaining all the time about how boring it was, how stifling it was, the big three networks. Oh goodness, is this all we get? A vast wasteland, all that kind of, people weren't happy about it at the time. But now there's a tendency to look back at that as a simpler time. So, that nexus, and this was a big, going back to the conversation about internet free speech in the mid 1990s, that was the big difference, was that there was, and that was ultimately why the regulations, that was declared unconstitutional. Congress had no natural authority to regulate internet speech. There was no public resource that the internet consumed that gave the government a reason to regulate internet speech. And that's why we have free speech on the internet to this day.
Yeah, it was so bottom up, it just kind of slipped in, right? And before we get away from it, I want to ask you, you wrote about the Netizen. Was that your concept, the Netizen?
I don't remember. I think I don't remember, to be really, really honest. It was sort of I just remember it being kind of an ambient idea. We were thinking a lot at Wired. This was at Wired Magazine, just to ground everybody. This is Wired Magazine in probably 1996 or so. At the time, Wired was, I didn't realize how, I knew it was special at the time, but I didn't realize how really special Wired was until, I really had done a lot more journalism in a lot more places. But Wired was a unique place because we owned this story in this way that nobody did at the time, which was essentially, what is this internet thing? And it was obviously a very unique group of people, which, well, that's how I got to know you. And so, there was this real moment there where the way I've described it, I'm a skier. So the way I've described it is something that never happens in journalism, which is untracked snow. That doesn't happen in journalism very often, where you really have a powder day. But that did happen for about 5 years at that time. And one of the concepts that Wired in general was thinking a lot about was what would be the political impact of this technology, and what were we already seeing? In other words, to the extent that people were using the internet and were thinking about it with a political dimension, what were those characteristics, and who were those people, and what were they going to do with it?
I'm just
And that's
realizing
what the Netizen was about, basically.
I'm realizing when you talk about that Wired and the Electronic Frontier Foundation started right around the same time and in the same place, really, which was a virtual place, which was the Well, the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which is still there as an online community. And back then it was like a very new thing, this idea that you could meet online as though you were meeting in a coffee house and cook this stuff up. So each one of those initiatives had its own conference on the Well, and beginning as private conferences where they sort of hashed out, what is this about? What are we going to do? And I think that the same insights were driving both of them. And you said something earlier about how journalists don't necessarily understand free speech. And at the time, the problem was neither journalists nor law enforcement persons understood the internet and understood the technology that was beginning to emerge. And of course, John Perry Barlow had the key insight that somebody needs to talk to these people and let them know. So EFF started doing that as a policy organization, and Wired started doing that as media.
That's right. And it was a big, again, at the time, I thought of my job as largely one of educating the media. Obviously, I would hope to rally a broader public at the same time, but really, I thought the core audience was educating other journalists because of the amplification effect that might have, that they would start to understand that. And when I wasn't paying attention, they would write it on their own, that essentially these are speech issues we're talking about, not just what about the children. And that really is the tenor of the conversation at the time, which was, what is this going to do to kids? What if kids encounter pornography? None of which is great, of course, but the trade-offs were not really part of that conversation. And so trying to elevate that was really, really important.
So what do you think about these ideas of like there's a big furor about what's called cancel culture. And I keep telling people that I don't think there is such a thing as cancel culture. I think that kind of stuff has been going on all along, and that it's not really specific to any one sort of cultural milieu, that people are always trying to cancel. They're always trying to shut other people down or censor or whatever. So given that that's so prominent and prevalent in our thinking, that we kind of want to shut people up, it's really important to protect free speech, right? Because the natural inclination that a human has is not to favor free speech, but to accept their own speech, as Scoop said earlier.
I think that's right. And this is a really hard one. I was just thinking some more this morning. So here we are, what is it? It's late January 2022. And as you and I are talking, there's this issue on Spotify with Joe Rogan, and what his about what's to be done. Neil Young has said that he's leaving Spotify, and Joni Mitchell and Nils Lofgren are leaving Spotify because they are publishing Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan routinely has essentially COVID misinformation idiots on his show all the time and gives them a voice. I've thought a lot about this one, and of course I don't support the misinformation, but I also kept thinking to myself, like, I wonder if Neil Young picked the wrong fight. On the one hand, I'm like, it's good that we're having this conversation. I will give a lot of credit there to him for elevating that conversation, and we are having it, and I guess that's good. It is good, but there's also a part of me that just sort of, again, going to what you're saying, which is the desire to just say, well, if we just made it go away, that would somehow solve our problem of people not wanting to get vaccinated on some level, or, it would disempower that conversation. And that part is the part where I'm not convinced that that's how it would play out.
What's interesting to wonder about kind of what was the real strategy here. My assumption was, I think Neil Young knows that saying he's going to take himself off Spotify, which he couldn't really do. He couldn't remove his music because he doesn't own it, right? But he got them to remove it. And he did it in a very high profile way. And that really does raise consciousness about the disinformation, not just on Joe Rogan's show, but just kind of that's in the infosphere right now. And I thought maybe that was all he was trying to accomplish. I don't know. I don't think that he thought he would get Joe Rogan kicked off, but he's had some success because Joe Rogan apologized today, right?
Yeah, and again, I actually think he was very effective at elevating the conversation. So, but that's valuable. I think, it is valuable.
It's hard to know.
The part of me where I'm hesitating is that I'm not sure what we do next. You know what I'm saying? Like, even if Joe Rogan went away tomorrow, which is not going to happen, but even if he did, I'm not sure that we would necessarily be in a better information space without him. That's, I guess, the part where I get a little stuck myself, to be really candid. And this goes to your question of cancel culture. There's an impulse to just say, well, make it go away and the problem will go away. But I think what we're really seeing is that these are not problems of any one individual or any one publisher. These are problems of human epistemology. and the information in a democratized network is always going to be there. And it's not clear. I put it another way. Let's go back to what we were saying. Like, I sometimes feel like there's like a real nostalgia for 3 broadcast networks and a canonical notion of truth. And I don't think we're going back there at all, anytime, ever. So that's where I get hung up on cancel culture, which is not to say that I always disagree with the impulse that this is terrible or this is wrong, and it would be great if this wasn't happening right now. But I'm not sure that eliminating any speaker or even any publisher is necessarily going to get us to a better place collectively.
Well, of course, these private entities can do that if they want to. Go ahead, Scoop. Sorry.
Yeah, what I'm seeing when cancel culture comes into play is there are legitimate, seriously committed people who are, highlighting what's been going on and what they want to have done away with. And there's a lot more that are just piling on. Let's get on the bandwagon and get some free publicity. And that's the part that disturbs me. It's like you can listen to their statements, and they really aren't well versed on whatever the issue was. They're well versed on the fact that people's ears and eyeballs are focused on them when they jump on the bandwagon, and that just seems to be a real problem, for the people who are really trying to, highlight a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's, misinformation entrepreneurs are a real thing. That's a meaningful thing, and it's actually very effective and even lucrative. And that's why I question at times how much any single publisher going after any single. I mean, another thing to think about for a moment is like, and I say this all the time, is like, I don't even know. I wonder what do we do about the internet when we still haven't figured out what to do about cable television, which has been with us longer. And clearly, and again, this has been shown quantitatively, is actually, the internet tends to be the tail. The head of the dog is cable television in the United States. That's really where most of the information, if you treat this misinformation as an epidemiological problem, the primary vector tends to be cable television. It's what both originates and amplifies a lot of things, and then they ripple through the rest of the information space.
And when you say cable television, you mean cable news, right?
Well, yeah, but right, that's obviously it. Now again,
which is sort of like, the cesspool of media.
right,
there's so much bad shit on there.
It's terrible. But then look what happens here. Let's go back to the conversation we were having about journalism. Like, how many journalists you hear, like the reporting on Fox News about Fox News tends to be so tepid. And I think it's because journalists see themselves in Fox News. They see it's a news network, so we have to treat it differently because they're news. And yet, if the same thing were to happen on Facebook or on Spotify, the same journalists, would be tearing their hair out saying something must be done. So again, I think Scoop said this earlier. They love free speech when it applies to journalists, but if other people are doing it, then someone must protect the children. These are hard problems. I don't mean to trivialize these in any way, but what I am saying is that, like, the internet is just a manifestation of a broader problem we have, or a broader set of challenges we have around democratized speech, multi-channel experiences, the ability for people to gravitate towards experiences that reinforce their views, or even to amplify or create those views at various times. And I don't see simple solutions to any of that.
Well, I think part of the problem is having this sort of like 24/7 media blitz of political bias, all political bias, and you're getting it from the left and the right. And really, it's like driving people. I mean, people used to not think about politics that much. They didn't think about it all the time. They think about it enough to, like, vote, try to make a decision. And even that, sometimes they weren't necessarily that well informed, but they're not better informed now. Their head is full of misinformation instead of being full of no information. So we're not that much better off, really.
That's right. And, again, as much as everyone likes to say, like, oh, the cliche of your racist uncle posting on Facebook, what's the impact of your racist uncle posting on Facebook relative to a TV that's on all the time, pumping out garbage 24/7 from, the living room? I think your racist uncle probably has a smaller impact in the scheme of things, but I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, like you were saying, I used to feel nostalgic for the 3 network universe that we used to be in and all that. And I would say, wow, we're really being manipulated by all this propaganda now. But it's like, not only were we manipulated by propaganda then, but it was controlled by 3 networks, and really it was very controlled. The information that was being pumped into our heads at the time, it's always been controlled. And I think maybe the smartest thing to advocate right now is for people to be skeptical, always skeptical of anything that they hear.
I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, you have to just really, I think moderating news intake, which again is a somewhat heterodox idea, but I do think moderating your news intake is a good idea. Not single sourcing your news intake is a good idea. Bringing a lot of skepticism to that as well. Again, as much as I call myself a lapsed journalist, but I'm actually pretty down on journalism these days. I think journalism is the problem in a lot of ways. There's a lot of stories I've seen where I'm like, because I've been in those meetings where I go, I can picture the meeting where this happened. I can see the facts they had. I was an editor more than a writer, as I think you know. So I was like, I know how this story got edited. I can see it. I can see the whole thing, and you can see how I want to say false narratives, because usually what journalism gets wrong is not the facts. There's a lot of like false news. It's not the facts. It's the connecting the dots between facts is where things go off the rails. And I know how that happens. So, I'm just not convinced that what we need is more and better news. I don't think that that's the answer at this point. I think it's more along the lines of what you're saying, which is really people owning their own information intake and bringing a real skepticism to it. And I don't know how you do this in practical terms, but I'll say it nevertheless, maintaining a level of remove from it. You have to maintain your sense of self. You have to maintain your own perspective at the same time that you're allowing this kind of information to become part of your world. It's very challenging. And so, media literacy, I guess, is what I would say, is like a really undervalued skill and an undervalued thing to teach people, and children especially.
Well, back to the issue of internet censorship. I've managed to piss off a bunch of people who are internet champions, I guess, when I point out that some of the great things that are now really successful on the internet were popularized by porn.
Yeah.
You can't escape it. The dirty words and dirty pictures that they want to get away with are what popularized, the web. The web was kind of a geeky little thing, but when you found out you could get dirty movies on it, it's like all of a sudden everybody is on the web. Same thing with news groups and email and chat room, you name it. Porn popularized it, and when you point it out to the folks who want to, promote the internet, it's like, well, that's just the way it is. That's the way our culture works, really.
Yeah, that porn had a big role in essentially creating demand for the internet, which in turn led to a lot of infrastructure. The infrastructure that came out of porn had a really important role in the mainstream internet that we use today, and I think that's true. I try and keep that same thing in mind when I think about crypto these days, because at this point, my thinking about crypto, and I first of all, I think I'm probably wrong, but I have yet to really understand how crypto is super useful for anything other than essentially pyramid schemes and crime. I'm sure it has some utility. That was not true. And when again, going back to the 90s, it was clear that porn was driving a lot of innovation, but at the same time, it was also clear that all these other things were just going to be enabled by that. I don't see that right now with blockchain. But I'm also very willing to concede that I might just not. It's possible I don't get it, but I do think about that analogy to this day, and it's blockchain and crypto is kind of bringing that to the surface again.
Yeah, law enforcement looks at crypto as an evil thing. They take the approach of, well, if they're using crypto, then they have something to hide.
Right.
Yeah, the anonymity problem.
Or put another way to put it is the privacy problem, which is a better way to, I think, because privacy is a word we think of as a good thing, but except for when it's not. Exactly. There's a double-sided coin to all of that.
Well, I think we should shift gears because we've been talking about this for a while. And I know that the work that you've been doing more recently is more like content strategy and content design. And I think a lot of people don't really know what that is and how it works. So I was just wondering if you'd talk a little bit about that kind of thing that you've been doing.
Sure. So yeah, just I am these days a content designer. I mentioned this to you earlier, but I'm just left Facebook and Instagram after almost 7 years, and I had frankly a great experience there as a content designer. Content design is a user experience discipline, meaning like the stuff you see on the screen when you use Facebook, Instagram, or almost any big platform these days. And it's a design discipline. We think like designers, we are designers, and we're designing the word parts of the interface experience. So, you think of a designer designing the pixels, where's the button go, where's, how does it all look? Content designers work in partnership. Those designers are called product designers. Content designers work in partnership with product designers, and we do the word parts of the interface. So that will be everything from what's a feature called to what's the text that appears on a button, on a button that says, does it say go? Does it say next? Does it say let's do it? Does it say, there's all sorts of things that it say. Error messages, all the parts of a digital interface that really have to do with the text that's part of the framework of the product itself is what content design is all about. It's been fascinating, and I learned so much.
How did that relate to the work that you had done before?
That's a really funny story. It's a little cheesy if I tell the story, but I'll tell it because it's so cheesy it doesn't sound true, but it is true. So I'll tell it. essentially the house I'm sitting in right now, this wall behind me, I was an editor at Time Inc., working at Business 2.0 magazine in the mid 2000s. Had an opportunity to buy a terrible house in San Francisco that needed a lot of work, which is the house I'm sitting in right now. That took 2 years for me to basically, I was actually ended up being kind of the general contractor of my own house. So managing the construction crews, and I had didn't have much money. So I really had to be very resourceful about building this house, working with what I had, solving a lot of problems. I had a great friend who was an architect who gave me a great set of very minimal blueprints. In other words, she had a great vision, but the details were not there. So I had to figure all that out. I loved it. And I really enjoyed that problem of figuring out essentially how do we hack this house together to solve the problems I wanted to solve, to make it look like something I wanted to live in, and within the budget that I could afford. That basically led to a career change for me, where I realized I wanted to be more on the side of thinking about product problems than just writing articles. It took a long time. I ended up doing some consulting, essentially where I was somewhere between a product manager and an editor for a bunch of new products. So a couple people came to me, this is all just before the Great Recession, saying, hey, we want to build this new editorial thing. And that was me. I was the person who built it. So I both kind of designed the content frameworks, set the tone and the voice, and built the team that did it. And I love that. And I knew I was doing something weird and I didn't know what to call it. Didn't have a name. I ended up being a product manager for a bit, for about 3 years. I was a product manager at Flipboard, which was a really good experience, doing essentially their native publishing templates. So when the New York Times or Forbes magazine wanted to publish on Flipboard, it would look like a New York Times article or essentially the templates that enable them to maintain their branding while at the same time having a dynamic automated system for publishing content on Flipboard. I like being a PM, but I also realized I wasn't really using this editorial background that I had, or this research background that I have. I've done some research work, also journalism, we call that research sometimes too. So I was looking for something that would kind of bring those two things a little bit closer together. I'm not a marketing person. I'm not a branding person. I'm a product person. So I was looking for something that kind of was a combination. And I sort of during what I call the autumn of coffee, where I spent a fall wandering around San Francisco trying to look for a job, telling people that here's what I do. I got this sort of little Venn diagram. I have this editorial background, I have a product background, and I have a research or ethnographic background. So user experience research is also part of what I do. Again, sometimes I used to call that journalism or reporting, but I've also worked for IDEO a little bit, so I understand that as well. And I was trying to synthesize all those things. And a lot of people said, hey, that's really cool. I have no idea what that is, until I met the woman who was at the time the head of content design at Facebook, who said, oh yeah, that thing you're describing, we call that content design. and that led to a job. She was right. That's exactly why I've enjoyed it. That's why I still love it, and why I'm still going to be doing more of it, is because it synthesizes those three things that I really, really appreciate and brings them together in this way that I find really satisfying.
Well, since you're in the process of leaving the Facebook organization, my inevitable question is, what do you think of Meta?
Meta, the name?
Yeah, well, Meta, the name, and Meta, the idea that they have, the idea that they're going to build a metaverse.
The metaverse, well, I'm not that interested in the metaverse, frankly, personally.
Me neither.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, anybody who's been around since the 90s certainly understands that we've seen this movie many, many times. Although I will say, like, I think, and this is not my idea, this is Ben Thompson from Stratechery's idea, so I want to be super clear about the provenance of this. He actually reframed the metaverse for me in a way that actually made me think, okay, that is a thing. It's not the VR thing. It's the metaverse is a thing. And his definition of the metaverse is not the VR part, the visual thing that we think of. Is he said that maybe the better way to think about the metaverse is that it's a series of experiences that are wholly abstracted from reality, that they are just completely virtual from their antecedents. this is where crypto and blockchain and anonymity starts to become meaningful. If I can have an identity that really does not have to connect to my real identity on some level, and that identity can be portable between different experiences and different surfaces, that's a meaningful idea. That's a metaverse idea under his definition. And that part, and the other part about his definition of the metaverse is that you realize a lot of us, or many of us, have already been doing this in a lot of ways for some time. In various ways. Video gaming is one where obviously you see that a lot. Network video gaming. There's just tons and tons of places where you have an online persona, an online identity, and you can have an entire reality which has very little to do with physical reality, as opposed to something which is more skeuomorphic, to use that word, which means, of course, an experience that's derived or kind of represents a familiar reality. Facebook would be a great example. Look, it's all about my real identity, my real name, whatever, no matter what I do in Facebook, it's still ultimately connected to my actual identity on some level. That definition of the metaverse I find more satisfying. I don't necessarily think it's something I'm dying to work on, but I find that to be a more plausible definition of what the metaverse might actually be. The VR part that we think about, the goggles and the avatars and all that stuff, I'm just really skeptical about how much that will catch on for a bunch of reasons.
Yeah, 3D movies, right?
3D movies, all of it, like anything that requires something you have to wear, period.
Yeah. And you might get dizzy, you might get a headache. I love 3D movies, but I know a lot of people who won't go near one.
Right. So I'm just very skeptical that is what we're talking about. But the idea that like wholly digital experiences might be more of an intentional thing, and that there might be more portability or fluidity between them, that actually makes some sense to me. But
yeah, I was pretty sure this couldn't be a VR thing that they're talking about, because VR is just not going to cut it. And you mentioned the idea of portable identity, and that what that makes me think of is, Facebook's monopoly right now is on sort of like personal data and personal experience. And if you could report some of that stuff away from Facebook, that might, I guess, be challenging for them, and that people may be less adherent to the Facebook platform. And, some people, Cory Doctorow, for instance, are saying that the real problem with companies like Facebook is the monopoly they have, really via network effect. And that one way to resolve that problem of a monopoly is what Cory calls adversarial interoperability. I don't know if that's his term, but he's used it a lot. But the idea is that essentially like require every big system like that to have a robust API, so that people building other systems could have access to the identities and the experiences of those users. Anyway, I'm just throwing that out there. What do you think about that?
When I hear that, what I really think of is just like, that would never work. Not because of Facebook, and I can imagine, because I don't think that's what people want. And
they want just a place to go, one place to go, because a lot of people complain about Facebook and would go somewhere else if they thought that they could find the same universe there.
I'm not sure if that's true. They say that. And for one thing, I've learned from a lot of user experience research, and I think political consultants see the same thing, but I don't have that experience, is people say one thing and they do another. They say that, but that's not what they do. What I do think is the bigger concern, though, and we've seen this right now, is like, look, essentially we had that world on some level, except Apple decided to call it tracking. Well, when Apple does it, they call it personalization. When somebody else does it, Apple calls it tracking. And that was a little content design moment that I thought was, that was when I stopped trusting Apple on this. As a content designer, when I was like, oh, if it's a first party thing and you do it, you call it personalization. And when everyone else does it, you call it tracking. Well, that suggests that you're trying to hide something. So
you mean you actually trusted Apple before then? Did you trust any of these guys?
I distrusted where they were coming from on this particular initiative, but if you really take that whole thing, that was exactly what we're talking about here, what Corey's talking about, which was the ability to share your data broadly, so that, you know, these things were all about giving you relevant ads. Now, you can say I don't like ads, but this was something I sometimes heard inside the building at Facebook, which is nobody likes ads, but the one thing they really don't like is irrelevant ads. That's true.
It's true.
Excuse me. And what we're seeing here is, again, it's all in the framing, of course, tracking versus personalization. But when given the choice, people say, I don't want my information to follow me around. I don't want my information to be shared by other people. So what Corey's talking about is essentially the same kind of vulnerability or sense of exposure that people are experiencing right now, but on an even broader and more intimate and personal level. And I'm not sure people really want that or would want that if you offered it to them. Never mind what Facebook or Google might say.
The whole idea of there perhaps being a replacement for Facebook, and a place that would be just as good. And I've seen lots of attempts, and I've seen people on Facebook that I know, some famous folk, that have said, well, I'm going off of Facebook, goodbye. And then they're back in a few weeks or months. And because the problem with leaving a big, you know, think about herd mentality, problem with leaving the herd is you can go off to this new place and find that it's not well populated. And that seems to be the problem is, you know, it would be great if some of these outfits worked, but you can't really get that same experience without the people. And if the people don't come over, it's not much of an experience.
I think that's true. And I think that's especially true on Facebook. I mean, I said this is when I went to work for Facebook, and at the very beginning was what I actually came to really appreciate. I come from a magazine background, to be really clear, okay? I always have assumed my passions have always been in interests. Like, I think people like interests, you know, like, what are you geeky about? Let's celebrate that. Let's go deep on that. Let's form communities around that. And that's true. Facebook's great strength is that it is something more meaningful than that. And this was something I had to really wake up to as somebody who spent their entire career going deep on interest, was real world relationships are incredibly meaningful. And there's really no other platform that has even come close to creating what Facebook has created, which is to say a map of your life, a social grid of your life as you've lived it from essentially as far back as you want to go to the present day. That's very valuable. I really think that's Facebook's moat, to be honest, more than anything else. It's the value I get out of it to this day. You know, where else am I going to connect with the guy who was in my 6th grade class who I haven't seen since? But now I know he's living in San Diego playing guitar and having a great life. Like, I love that. That's really meaningful. To me. And
well, I was going to say, to that question of what are you geeky about? I think you're geeky about a fire truck.
Yeah, this has been so again, for those who can't see the picture, you're looking at a picture of a very, very small Japanese fire truck sitting in the middle of a vineyard in Sonoma County. So yeah, during the last couple of years, I've been really into cars. I've always been into cars, but cars kind of really have become, in many ways, my path to civil society in the last couple of years. And Japanese cars have been both a combination of my bridge to civil society and my bridge to Japan for the last 3 years that I haven't been able to go there. I'm a big Japan geek and have very deep connections there, and haven't been able to go. So coincidentally, I imported a car from Japan. Again, this is not to say like a Japanese car like you go to your Honda dealer and get. I imported a vintage Japanese car from the 1990s about 5 years ago. This car that I always admired when I went to Japan. I always thought it was really cool. Imported one. It's a Nissan Skyline. Love it. It's been great. I spent some time in it yesterday. But basically, in the course of importing that car, it's kind of like doing a home renovation or any of these things that are really complicated. And once you've done it, you're like, okay, now I understand, and I can do it again, and it'll be a lot easier. Well, that's true. And I decided that I would get into something really kind of cheap and weird. There's a lot of really cheap and weird stuff that you can get once you kind of don't feel intimidated by it. And this little Japanese fire truck was that. I ordered it in March of 2020, just when the pandemic started. It showed up in my driveway in July of 2020. And
how did they get it to you?
It came on a boat and came on a truck. They put it on they're put it on a boat, like one of those roll on, roll off, a Roro, drove it onto a boat, landed in Long Beach. Dude put it on the back of a truck and it showed up in my driveway. And it's been the most charming, wonderful thing one of the best experiences of my life. It's just, and for two reasons. One, it's just because of its effect on people. It's just, people just look at it. I've described it, the best way to describe it, I think, is it's like driving a puppy. If you've ever walked down the street with a puppy and the way people react when you have a puppy, it's the exact same thing. Like, they're just enamored, they're fascinated, they're intrigued. You're just the dude holding the leash, like whatever. They don't really care about you, which I love, but they want to interact with this thing. And it has the exact same effect on people, which has been great because it's so small. Like, it's really hard to describe how small it is. The way it's 2 feet shorter than a Mazda Miata. It's 5 inches shorter than an MG midget. So it's very, very small. And but it was a fully functioning fire truck and its history is written on its door. It's from this little town in Nagano, this little ski town in Nagano, where I now have a whole lot of friends, by the way. It's been really charming. And that's been the other part. So during the pandemic, it was this safe thing to do. You could drive around San Francisco in this little COVID bubble and just make people happy on the street. And the really cool thing about it has been also just how it's been a bridge between San Francisco and Japan. It's this little piece of Japan that doesn't belong here. And Japanese people in the Bay Area, they get weepy. It's beautiful. They just are like, you can see them falling down a memory hole when they
Have you put out any fires with it?
I have not. I haven't tried. All the pieces are there to do it, but I haven't tried. But I've been having a lot of fun with it. And the other thing I've as a car geek, of course, everybody loves fire trucks, and I like fire trucks as much as anybody. But again, it's just been this entirely fascinating act. So I've been able to access 2 communities during COVID that I really would have never otherwise, which one is like the Japanese American community in the Bay Area, and 2, firefighters in the Bay Area. So you go to a firehouse and you stop. One of the fun things is I will drive down the street and you'll see a fire truck coming the other direction, and the firefighters are waving at you like 5-year-olds, like they're like a 5-year-old looking at a fire truck, except the firefighters on the fire truck and the woman driving the truck, they're like,
oh, that's so funny.
It's the best. So it's been really, really a great way to just stay cheerful, frankly, and cheer up other people while doing it. And then the other fun thing is it has this amazing siren. The siren is great, but the siren is also a PA system, and it has an input jack. So I can just run my iPhone through the siren, and it's been really fun. So playing music during Christmas, I drove around playing Christmas tunes really loud. A Japanese woman here in the Bay Area did this amazing recording for me of she had been in her Japanese high school public address class. And so she has the skills, kind of like Scoop does. And she recorded this impeccable recording of a Godzilla alert, like what you hear.
Oh, wow.
Godzilla is, there's been Godzilla sightings in the city in English and Japanese, but it sounds exactly like what you would actually hear from a Japanese PA system. And it's charming.
Have you got a Telstar Logistics logo on that thing?
Nope, I just leave it just the way it is. I just try and keep it as spooky, like a little Blu-ray picked it up from Kitamane, Japan, and dropped it in my driveway as possible. I don't touch it at all.
So I guess we're close to the end, but I really meant to ask you, are you still doing Telstar Logistics?
A little bit. That's kind of my persona. Telstar Logistics, for those who don't know, was kind of a hack that I did with the Jeep that I drive to basically make it look like a commercial vehicle so I could park everywhere. I still drive that Jeep. That Jeep is actually parked right behind the wall, right behind me. It's actually now a little bit of a classic, not so much because of Telstar Logistics, because suddenly everybody likes Jeep Cherokees. They're really cool now. It's still just a persona that I have. And it is my online persona remains Telstar Logistics. And people don't remember what it was as much. It was much more of a mid-2000s thing than it is today. And now people think of me as the Japanese fire truck guy, and then you have to go, wait, no, that like 2 or 3 car personas before that, I had this other thing, and people just go, what? But it's still there.
All right, I think we're about at the end of our hour, and I'm like, wow, I have a lot more I could talk about it. Maybe you can come back sometime.
I would love that. So much to talk about.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. With John Lepkowski, I'm Scoop Sweeney. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.